The USSR, a country whose hands reached almost every country in Europe. After World War II, Moscow subjugated only those that could benefit the Kremlin: Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and this was far from a complete list of Soviet satellites. Pocket secret services in these countries helped to maintain communist order in the region, which in the imagination of the Moscow political elite was a worthy competitor to capitalism. On the other hand, behind the Iron Curtain, the world did nothing but criticize and express concern about the atrocities of the communists and their fighting dogs. And perhaps no one tried to stop the USSR. After the Yalta Conference in 1945, it seemed that the powerful of this world have already decided everything and have divided the world each in their own way. Poland also fell under the hot hand. With the coming to power of the communists in Warsaw, a new special service appeared, the Security Department, or UB for short, the Polish secret police, which was responsible for the deaths of thousands of people. In 1945, when Poland managed to expel the Nazi plague, everyone joyfully celebrated the victory. But unlike most of the countries occupied by the Union, the Poles knew well what communism was. Nevertheless, they realized that they were not in a position to dictate their rules of the game to the Kremlin. Moreover, the Soviet communists immediately began the process of creating a new satellite. The creation of the Polish Committee of National Liberation began. Later, it would be proclaimed the only legal authority in the country. And so, in 1945, Warsaw was engulfed by communism. However, some historians believe that it all began much earlier. Preparing a springboard for the regime's expansion, they began to neutralize those who might cause problems in the future.
Katyn was the place where about 25,000 Polish officers were tortured and shot. The NKVD was responsible for all those shootings. The soldiers were shot in the head, and the bodies were thrown into a pit. For years, the Russians did not recognize this crime.
Swift trials, even swifter sentences. The UB's agents were hunting down people who were potentially dangerous to communism. There were two verdicts: execution by shooting or exile. All of this had to be done within just 1 year, because the communists were preparing a referendum for the Polish population. They did not want discontent or negative results at the ballot box, and while UB officers were rounding up politically unreliable citizens, grand plans for remaking Poland were being prepared behind the Kremlin's walls. Despite all the agreements reached at the Yalta Conference, which included free elections in Poland to achieve the country's independence, the formation of a communist pro-Russian regime in Warsaw began immediately after the Germans were expelled from the country. The UB was created on the model of the NKVD and the German Abwehr, and therefore their traditions and methods of work were no different from their colleagues in the same shop. Moreover, the activities of the newly created agency were constantly monitored by Soviet curators. Nothing happened in Poland without their knowledge. Even in the departments of the then Polish police, there usually was a representative from the USSR. For example, the first head of the KGB, Ivan Surov, even before being appointed to this position, led the liquidation of the Polish underground, which dared to challenge the Polish pro-Russian communist authorities. He coordinated the operation to arrest 16 resistance leaders.
These events became known as the Trial of the 16. In 1945, a show trial was held against the leaders of the Polish resistance movement. They were invited to negotiations, and as soon as they arrived, they were immediately arrested and taken to Moscow to stand trial.
In 1946, the communists held a nationwide referendum in Poland. It was a kind of imitation of democracy and freedom of choice. An attempt to whitewash communism. There were only 3 questions: the first, the abolition of the Senate and its liquidation; the second, the nationalization of industry and the consolidation of socialist economies; and the third, changes on the western border. Most people voted against these 3 proposals, but to tell the truth, the communists were not interested in this. The main task was to create the appearance. And then everything was in the best traditions: intimidation and falsified results, which showed that on all 3 issues from 61 to 91% of people were in favor of such changes. This is where it all began. The country irrevocably sank into communism. All that remained for the Kremlin was to push its people through in the 1947 elections, and here the UB employees helped. They did so that, in a strange way, the communists had practically no competitors, so the Reds and people close to them won 394 seats out of a possible 434. Just a month before the campaign began, about 100,000 members of the People's Party were arrested, most of them on trumped-up charges. About 100 were executed by the country's secret police, the Polish Security Department. In post-war Poland, the Security Department was perhaps the most powerful body of power and control. This is because, in addition to the duties of the secret police and repression of Poles, they were engaged in intelligence, counterintelligence and other tasks inherent in special services. In general, there were not so many main areas of activity: the fight against the underground, against political dissidents, dissenters, oppositionists and intellectuals. And also protecting the economy, controlling prisons, investigating and spying on their own people. More than 30,000 people served in the UB, not including informants, and in addition they kept under control about 300,000 civil servants, from ordinary law enforcement officers to prison guards.
By 1953, there was one security service officer for every 800 Polish citizens. In the country's 45-year history, its secret services had never been so powerful.
One of the main tasks of the UB was to fight against underground anti-communist groups. These were the cursed soldiers. Their number, according to various estimates, ranged from 120 to 180,000 people. They fought against the Moscow Special Services and their subordinate departments. But the soldiers could not resist the Red Terror, which had an army of more than 500,000 people. Underground activities were strictly suppressed by the UB. Just one leaflet, which was handed over, let's say, into the wrong hands, could put an end to the activities of the partisans. The goal of eradicating the USSR from Poland was never realized. Death squads caught the military and, without trial or imprisonment, killed them on the spot. But the Poles were no less tough. 1945, the battle in the village of Karylivka. The partisans eliminated almost 70 NKVD members. The Soviets then retreated, and when they returned, they burned the entire village and more than 700 houses there to the ground.
It is believed that the cursed soldiers were completely eradicated by Polish special services by 1947. However, historians claim that the last member of the resistance movement was Joseph Franczak. He died in battle in 1963, 18 years after the war.
Another tragic example of the UB's activities is the massacre of members of the anti-communist movement, Freedom and Independence. Unlike the cursed soldiers, they tried to resist the Soviets in a peaceful manner. They began their activities in 1945 and quickly realized that the Kremlin understood no language but violence. The conflict quickly escalated into armed confrontation, but the situation is the same as with the cursed. It was useless to compete with trained military and well-equipped special forces units. Therefore, the members of the movement focused their attention on helping other partisan movements. They supplied them with information, were engaged in creating false documents so that those persecuted by the regime could safely leave the country. However, such a struggle was not destined to last long. The UB agents exiled their agents. The secret services knew everything about the anti-communists. They were offered to surrender, come out of the underground, and then, perhaps, the authorities would think about pardoning them. When the underground was exposed, they were arrested, some tortured, some exiled.
All communist governments in Poland tried to fight their way through the crisis. Each time the course of events improved briefly, and then only got worse. People began to become more and more disillusioned with communism. In the end, it all came down to an outright rejection of this ideology.
Polish agents were the instrument that controlled people's moods in the post-war period. And since the crisis was an integral attribute of communism, all those who were dissatisfied were isolated from society. As a result, people were divided into two categories: those who speak, but only about good things, and those who remain silent because of fear. Only from 1945 to 1956, agents of the Security Department threw up to 2 million people into prison. During the same period, 6,000 death sentences were passed, and the number of missing and maimed people is simply impossible to count. The Poles placed their hope for a free life without communism on the Western countries, hoping that they would help throw off the shackles of terror. But no, resisting the socialist bloc, under whose control there were 7 countries, was not so easy.
People didn't like the Soviets, but they also understood that they couldn't do anything about it. They realized that they would no longer be free, They wouldn't have their own laws, but they always dreamed of this freedom.
In 1953, there was a man who openly spoke to the whole world about the atrocities of Polish and Soviet agents. Józef Swiatło, a general of the UB, responsible for controlling prisons and torture in them. Unofficially, he was nicknamed the Butcher. In 1953, during a working visit to the GDR, he managed to slip away to the United States, where he remained. He worked for the CIA, helped journalists and talked about what and how communist Poland and its secret services lived. In addition to being a consultant to American intelligence, all his data was published by the publication, Free Europe. Later, it was his, so to speak, revelations that would lead to reforms not only in the Polish Secret Service, but also in the political life of the country. Warsaw declared him enemy number one, a traitor who should simply be executed, so after 1954, Swiatło had to live under the Witness Protection Program in the United States, which helped him not only to hide from the Soviet secret services, but literally disappear from life.
General Józef Swiatło revealed the entire inner workings of the Polish party and its secret services. In total, he gave more than 100 interviews to journalists. His information was so valuable, and the general himself so important, that the American Witness Protection Program completely classified information about him. To this day, even the exact date of his death is unknown.
In order to whitewash the image of the Secret Service and the internal structure of the country, reforms were needed. First, to reduce the number of staff by 25 to 30%. Second, to reduce the number of repressions, at least so it seemed at first glance. In fact, the murders and torture continued, but not so openly, and most importantly, to show that the UB members were disbanded, the name of the special service was also changed. From the Security Department, the agency turned into the Security Service or SB.
In order to reach some kind of understanding with the people during the crisis, the regime tried to somehow support the people and create various democratic institutions, laws, for example, administrative courts, that is a very important institution. But they were all created with certain nuances. The ombudsman cannot work if the code of procedures for his work or the constitutional court is not adopted.
And it turned out that the government seemed to make concessions, but in reality it only made the appearance of democracy. Such tricks were the last straw for the Poles. In June 1956, people went out to protest in Poznan. The demonstration was initiated by local workers, who were dissatisfied with their salaries and working conditions. About 100,000 people took to the streets demanding to improve their situation. And the protests spread with such force that the march grew into protests against the communist regime. To disperse the demonstration, the authorities sent units of the UB, the army and law enforcement officers, as well as several dozen armored personnel carriers and almost 400 tanks. The military immediately opened fire. More than 500 demonstrators were injured, 50 were killed. Media and politicians first called all the clashes provocations, then dropped them. In the 1970s, a man named Karol Józef Wojtyła appeared in Polish history. In 1978, he would become Pope John Paul II. His support for his homeland and his fight against communism would give Poles hope for a new life. He would become the first pope to meet with the Kremlin's supreme commander, Mikhail Gorbachev at the time. And as you know, communists and the church are incompatible concepts. John Paul II supported Poland, made speeches to the people and often said not to forget who they are. Faith in God, according to him, was supposed to help survive the challenges that the communist regime poses to citizens and believers.
Millions of Poles listened to his speeches. We listened to the Pope's words with tears in our eyes. He treated us seriously. He often told us that we should do this and that. We should not be afraid. We are Catholics, decent, young people. The future belongs to us.
Only after a year in office did the Pope make his first official visit to Poland in 1979. His speech was largely about life under communism. The impact on the Poles, a Catholic country, was so strong that as a result his arrival became a symbol of the beginning of a revolution, long, drawn out and variable, but it did begin. This time the armed uprising and underground activities were transferred to the diplomatic plane. And its beginning became the end of communism in Poland.
The first secretary of the Communist Party, Leonid Brezhnev, before the Pope's visit to Poland, said the following to the Polish secretary of the Communist Party: "We know that the Pope is a wise man. Tell him to announce that he is ill." It would be better for him not to visit Poland. They tried to stop him, but they failed.
Already in 1980, a trade union called Solidarity appeared in Poland. Its leader was Lech Wałęsa. In general, the appearance of Solidarity on the political arena of Poland was also a reaction to the economic crisis in the country. People liked the idea of a trade union and their struggle for a democratic world and freedom of choice, and given that the movement was supported by the opposition and dissidents, and even the Catholic Church, Solidarity grew into a socio-political movement with the support of 10 million people. Every third Pole was in this movement. The only problem was that some wanted the overthrow of the regime, while others wanted communism, but with a new, more loyal face.
If you never grew up in communism, you won't understand its essence and you won't understand why we tried to get out of it. I was lucky to grow up in a family that was good at knowing who the communists were. Accordingly, we knew that there was another free world.
The UB and Kremlin's special services noticed the extensive focus on Solidarity. Recognizing its potential as a political rival to communism, Moscow planned to impose martial law, reform legislation, and ban Solidarity, which they subsequently did. In 1981, martial law; in 1982, a complete ban. Representatives of the movement had to hide; they went underground. Leaders were arrested, including Lech Wałęsa. While the rest of the representatives were engaged in underground self-publishing, the Catholic Church remained the only instrument that freely and openly spoke about the crimes of communism against representatives of Solidarity, and the communists could not destroy the Church in such a religious country as Poland. Then it would mean a complete break with the Vatican and with the civilized world too. More and more people learned about the atrocities committed against Solidarity members, and the country was once again gripped by protests. This time in 1987. The demands were the legalization of Solidarity. Having felt a breath of fresh air, people no longer wanted to live under communism, to put up with all its atrocities. And in Moscow they understood that if they did not make concessions to the people, the regime would not last long. They decided to legalize Solidarity, but to win him over to their side. In turn, Solidarity understood that it was better to play along, and then make the final push towards freedom. Having agreed to all the conditions of 1989, the so-called Round Table began.
The Round Table was an event where communists and representatives of the opposition, that is representatives of Solidarity and the intelligentsia, gathered in one room for discussion. They discussed the changes needed for Poland. The main topic was not about moving away from socialism, but about trying to improve it as a system.
In June 1989, democratic elections were held. The communists finally lost their positions. It was useless to rig the vote results. Public pressure simply did not allow this to be done. Newspapers, radio, and television all spoke with one voice, unequivocally and with a smile on their faces, about the beginning of a new life for Poland.
Ladies and gentlemen, on June 4, 1989, communism in Poland fell.
As for the Secret Service, it was disbanded and completely reorganized. Those who failed to flee the country went to prison. A wave of lustration and decommunization swept through the country. Large-scale reforms began. Poland rapidly began to converge with European countries. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union collapsed, turning into Russia, a talented successor in matters of terror, but useless in matters of development, both of the state and of its society.